Right. Well, thank you guys for joining us tonight. It's just me and Jared tonight. So if you haven't met me yet, I think I see a lot of familiar faces as usual. So I'm Lindsay, I'm one of the dietitians here. Rhonda, our other dietitian, is out for some birthday celebrations. So when you see her next, you'll have to tell her happy belated birthday. And Jackie, our other dietitian, unfortunately has left us. Yeah, kind of unexpected turn of events. Her fiance got a job in Dallas, Texas. And so it was just a good offer that he couldn't pass up, so she went down to Dallas, Texas. So we'll have a new dietitian replacing her. Her name is Lynetta Smith, and she'll be joining us. Hopefully by the next cooking school you'll get to meet her. So our topic tonight is pre and probiotics, a gut feeling. So we're talking about gut health. So just to kind of give you a little background about probiotics and kind of talk about that to get us started. I think it's really fascinating what we're learning about our gut health. You may hear about it more and more in the news. It's a new science. It's kind of a baby science that we've been learning about for years, but I think they're becoming even more interested in the role that our gut health can play in our entire body systems. Even with our mind, they're saying that it's almost got like a mind of its own down there. It's like another brain. So there's over 100 trillion cells in our intestines. 100 trillion. So that's 1,000 times more the number of cells in our entire body. So there's a lot going on down there, and those bacteria play a role in our health. So especially those probiotics, or those good bacteria. They've been shown to help improve our immune system, help our heart health, help our digestion, of course, help to fight off infections. So lots of very, very important roles there. And when that balance is off, so when we have those probiotics, when those guys get depleted, sometimes they can get depleted through chronic antibiotic use. If you've ever had a family member unfortunately suffer from C. diff, you may have heard of that. That's where that good bacteria is killed off and then the bad bacteria takes over. So that's one effect that can happen when that balance is off. Also, it can be caused from chronic stress or inflammation, also just poor nutrition, so not getting enough of those probiotics in your diet. So we're going to talk about that today, how to get more of them in your diet. And then also those prebiotics. Have you guys heard of those? Prebiotics? So you can think of them as food for the good guys. So they help to feed those probiotics. And prebiotics are basically just a type of carbohydrate or fiber that we find in plants. It's especially high in things like our fruits, our vegetables, beans, oats, whole grains. We find it in onion and garlic, honey, and pure maple syrup. So there's some good sources of those prebiotics. And so we're going to talk about some recipes that can help you get more of those guys too. So I'm going to turn it over to Jared so we can get the show on the road. And we're going to talk about our first recipe here, which is an apple, poppy seed, and kefir coleslaw. So who has heard of kefir? Yeah, lots of hands, yep. So kefir, this is one brand here. You'll find it in the dairy aisle, usually by the milk, sometimes over by the yogurts as well. So kefir is basically a cultured, fermented product. It's similar to yogurt. It has a lot of the similar nutrient profile, but it's a little bit of a thinner consistency, so it's more of like a drink. It also does have a little bit more protein in it, and a little bit more of those probiotics are found than you typically find in your yogurt per serving. So it's a little bit more potent in probiotics. And because it's fermented, that means that it is a little bit easier to digest if you have issues digesting lactose or dairy. Sometimes people that have that lactose intolerance can tolerate the kefir a little bit better. It doesn't give them digestive troubles.
Awesome. How many people have done different varieties of coleslaw? Right? Than your traditional cabbage, carrot, with a mayonnaise, sugar, right? Celery seed, the normal. Has anybody tried using sliced apples in their coleslaw? Yeah? What about jicama? There is so many different things that we can add to, and this is just one of very, very many varieties of making coleslaw. And my biggest issue when I make coleslaw is I always feel like I don't have enough liquid to add, like the sauce portion of the coleslaw, to add to the vegetables that are sliced up and ready to go, right? Even whenever I was making this, and of course, the recipe you guys have here, I have to multiply by like 6 or 8 to get enough servings for everybody to try. And so I'm looking at the liquid amount and I'm thinking there's no way that this is ever going to be enough, right? But the good thing is as those vinegars and everything are on the cabbage and the other fruits or whatever, they begin to kind of relinquish some of their juices that are naturally present as they start to break down. And those vinegars are a very, very important part of the process of making a coleslaw, so that it does help in that breaking down process. So it's definitely something that if you don't make it very often, or if it never really turns out, it's always crispy, you probably need to make it a lot sooner than you have been. Make it overnight, let it set overnight, always toss it really well before you serve it out, and that'll ensure that, because all those juices just drain to the bottom, right? So you toss it really well to make sure that all that's up. So one of the processes I wanted to kind of go over was with the apple, because it tells you to julienne those. Basically, that just means sliced, right? Thin slices, long, thin. You want it to be the same thickness as the cabbage that you're making, right? So basically, we're going to go in and we're going to core our apple, just very simply, straight down on each side, pop out the core. Let go. All right. Now again, this is one way of doing it. If you have a food processor, you can also use it.
Or maybe even like a mandolin slicer.
Yep. One problem that I've found is machinery has a tendency to beat the tar out of whatever it is that you're making, right? And in doing that, it kind of causes it to relinquish those juices a little bit prematurely, okay? And then you end up with a lot of small pieces instead of those nice big pieces that you want, piled on top of a pulled pork sandwich, right? Okay, so basically all I did is I took that half and I sliced it straight down, okay? Right where the core is, you're going to have a little bit of area that's a lot shorter, so you want to pull that aside, and then that leaves you with 3 stacks. Where are we at? There we go. That'll leave you with 3 stacks, sliced straight through, right? And then you're just going to leave those straight up. Cut them into nice, even strips, okay? Again, you can use a food processor for these type of things. It really is just up to you. If you're going to use it fairly quickly, you can probably get away with using a food processor or a mandolin. If it's something that you're going to not use until tomorrow, you may want to think about using cutting it by hand, right? Whenever it comes to the cabbage, there's all leafy greens, they all kind of run in one direction, right? They all come from the core, and they kind of go out and around. So we want to find those, kind of like if you're cutting beef, you want to cut with the grain. You want to do about the same thing. You just want to stay to where you're not going to have a lot of large pieces. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to come in at this at an angle, because then you'll end up with really wide strips instead of nice, thin pieces, okay? There's no method to the madness. Just keep it thin. Again, anytime you're slicing, cutting, dicing, one portion of the knife should be on the cutting board at all times, right? That's the best way to keep your fingers safe and not end up with pieces of gloves all inside your food, right? Nobody likes latex gloves in their food. So the most important part of this is just consistency. Keeping a nice consistent cut on your cabbage so that it all gets done at the same time. If you've got a lot of really thin stuff and a lot of really thick stuff, the thin pieces are going to be mushed by the time the thicker pieces are done and ready to eat. Okay? Same thing with the red cabbage. Stay.
So another thing I was going to point out is that this recipe is a good source of those probiotics and the prebiotics. So the probiotics are coming from the kefir, right? And then the prebiotics, we find the highest amounts in the inside of that apple. The pectin inside the apple is really high in that good fiber and that soluble fiber. It also helps to lower our cholesterol naturally. It helps to bind to the excess cholesterol in our bile salts and helps us remove it. So that's kind of why we picked this recipe, was because it had both. If you didn't have kefir, you could use Greek yogurt and kind of thin it out a little bit. I think it would work just as well. But I just thought it was kind of a unique way to use that product that you might have at home. Maybe you're drinking it for the benefits. It also contains the raw apple cider vinegar. So who uses this stuff at home? See this? Yeah. So I get a lot of questions about the raw apple cider vinegar versus just regular apple cider vinegar. So vinegars are a fermented food. So fermented products do help feed that good bacteria in our gut. The raw apple cider vinegar, however, has not been pasteurized, and so it still contains what we call the mother. Have you ever seen it has that kind of cloudy little goopy stuff floating around in there? That's the mother, and that has a lot of good proteins and enzymes and probiotics. So the raw is actually a good source of the probiotics, whereas the pasteurized stuff doesn't have that. So.
If you've ever used the filtered apple cider vinegar, you'll know the difference right off the bat. It does not have half the flavor that the raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar has. So the filtered, non-raw, is just not as flavorful as this is. So if you're looking in a dish, you're wanting that nice apple cider vinegar flavor really coming through in there, this is what you want to get, okay? Celadon Woods, right there. You'll get so much more flavor out of that than you would from the filtered, non-raw apple cider vinegar. And again, when it comes to substitution ingredients in this, you really can go wild. If you weren't going to use the kefir, you were going to use like a Greek yogurt. In this recipe, as it stands here, I would say add maybe a tablespoon of milk to the 3 tablespoons of plain yogurt. You could substitute that out, just 3 to 1, add a tablespoon of milk to it, whisk it up really good. That's going to thin it out to where you're going to have the consistency that you want. Okay?
What about raw milk?
I'm sorry?
What about raw milk?
If you were just using milk
Yeah.
instead of the kefir or the
No,
yogurt.
no. Adding raw milk, would that improve it?
Oh yeah, yeah. You can just add the raw milk right to the Greek yogurt. Just all you need is just to thin it out. You could even use water if you wanted, but milk is going to be it's not going to affect the flavor as much as what water would kind of dilute it down a little bit. So yeah, the raw milk would work perfect.
I was going to say, if homemade kefir, you could use some of the whey.
Oh yeah. Yep, that would be perfect.
Yeah, she was talking about homemade kefir and using some of that, and you were saying some of the whey to kind of thin it out. So has anyone ever made their own kefir or yogurt at home?
And they make it cheese.
Yeah? Awesome. Yeah, so yeah, it's a great way to get some of those probiotics, and it's pretty easy to make your own yogurt or kefir. You just want to make sure that you're using food safety principles, and because we are dealing with a fermented product, so if things go too fermented, it could be obviously make us sick. So I think we're going to move on to the next recipe. So I didn't get to ask you guys, what did you think of this recipe?
Just add a little
Good.
stevia.
A little bit of sweetness to it, yeah, maybe adding a little sweetness to it, yeah. Yeah, I think if you like a little bit more of a wetter coleslaw, like a little bit more of that dressing, you could kind of add a little bit more, like Jared was saying, as it does sit, it will obviously create more juices. But I think when I made it at home, I felt like I kind of like a little bit more dressing on my coleslaw, so you could even double the dressing part of there if you liked it like that. But I think it's a really pretty and colorful coleslaw, both of the different cabbages and the apple. So, yeah. All right, so I guess we're going to move right on to the next one. Here. Oh, question,
My husband will not eat poppy seeds. Is
Okay.
there something else you can substitute to give us that?
Yeah, so she's saying that her husband can't eat poppy seeds. So I would suggest maybe some sunflower seeds would be good.
Toasted sesame seeds would work just fine.
Toasted sesame seeds.
Yeah. Yeah, any type of nut would work just fine too. Almonds, slivered almonds would work great. Just kind of give it that crunch.
Okay, so this next recipe is a creamy Greek yogurt dressing, kind of like a ranch dressing essentially. So has anyone ever used that Greek yogurt in place of ranch or made your own ranch at home? No?
I substituted a lot of things.
Yeah, she's saying she substitutes Greek yogurt in a lot of things. So Greek yogurt is another great source of the probiotics. And the difference between regular yogurt and Greek yogurt is essentially they're made the same, but the Greek yogurt, they strain off a lot of they're straining off the liquid whey, right? Yeah, straining off the liquid whey and a little bit more of the lactose, so it's thicker in consistency, and it's got twice as much protein as regular yogurt. It has about roughly half the amount of carbohydrates in it, and sometimes it has a little bit more fat depending on the type that you're purchasing. And you'll see that we're using the full fat whole milk Greek yogurt in this recipe. And there's actually a lot of new interesting research coming out about dairy fats. We're finding that dairy fats actually have a lot of important fatty acids in them that can be actually cardioprotective, that can have benefits for our heart health and preventing stroke. And so we're kind of reconsidering even changing the dietary guidelines at some point, hopefully, to maybe include more of the fuller fat dairy. The main difference is that obviously the fuller fat dairy is going to have more calories than your lower fat. So if that's something you're trying to control or watch your calorie intake, something to be mindful of, because if we're drinking a gallon of whole milk a day versus a gallon of skim milk, that's quite a big caloric difference, right? So everything in moderation if you want to use the full fat. Another reason that we're using the full fat in this recipe is because we do want to have some fat with our veggies. That's typically what we're going to use this for, right? Is something like in a salad or as a dip with carrots maybe or other vegetables. Those vitamins that we find in our vegetables, like vitamins A, vitamin D, E, K, we need fat in our diet to help us to absorb those correctly. So if we have a nice, beautiful salad and we dump fat-free dressing on it, we're not going to get as much benefit. We're not going to absorb those vitamins and minerals as well. And so this recipe essentially is having that Greek yogurt as a base, and then we're adding in our typical seasonings that we find in our ranch, like dill. We've got a little bit of lemon, black pepper, salt. If you're watching your salt intake, you might consider decreasing the salt a little bit, as you'll notice that this recipe in 2 tablespoons, there's about 250 milligrams of sodium. So depending on what else you're eating this with, it could become could put a dent in your sodium intake. So something to be mindful of.
Question.
Yes.
What do you do with the extra whey? I mean, how can you use it?
That's a good question. I don't know. She's asking, what do you do with the extra whey?
Fit it to my chickens.
Throw it away.
She's saying she feeds it to her chickens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or feed it to little
Throw
miss,
away.
yeah, muffin.
Or the spider anyway.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Way too many nursery rhyme jokes, guys. Come on.
Yeah, I don't know. What could we use that?
Yeah, I've never found any real uses for the leftover whey. I mean, I'm sure adding it to, if you've got any type of animals at home, adding it to your dog's food, they'd love it. Like you said, feed it to the chickens.
Yeah, it's high in protein, so you can maybe add it to like a smoothie. I'm not sure how that would taste, but it would increase the protein content.
Yeah. It's got a little bit of a bitter.
Biscuits or pancakes, you could add the whey to it, it'd be liquid.
Yeah.
Maybe adding it to like a batter, yeah, pancake batter.
Cornbread.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah. I would say try it. Try it in like a smoothie, or try it in biscuits. That would be really good, I bet. You know, it would just be one thing to utilize that you're not throwing away. But yeah, I think there's a lot of purposes that you could probably use it for, like you said, with baking items or with feeding your animals. So it would definitely add the purpose to it for sure. Yeah.
And this recipe also has a prebiotic in it, the garlic. So garlic contains a prebiotic called inulin, and you might see that sometimes in ingredients lists on labels. If you ever look at those labels and study those ingredients lists, sometimes it's an added ingredient to foods to help boost the fiber in that food product. So that's how they will sometimes fortify. So garlic is high in that inulin, which is a great way to get that prebiotic. So this has both. It has those probiotics and the prebiotics in it. But I love making my own dressing at home because I think it just tastes a lot better. I think it tastes a lot more flavorful. You also get to control the ingredients in it, like the sodium. You know, sometimes that salad dressing can have quite a bit of sodium in it. And sometimes they're using lower quality oils that we tend to get enough of already in our diet, like soybean oil and corn oils. Instead, you can replace with a more heart-healthy oil like olive oil, avocado oil, etc.
Grapeseed oil.
Grapeseed oil, yeah, that's another good one.
Great. When it comes to this recipe, as far as breaking it down, your three pillar ingredients, right, is your oil, right, your vinegar, and the yogurt. Okay. Whenever you're making a oil and vinegar dressing, basically what you're doing is you're omitting the Greek yogurt, or in a lot of cases in the past we've probably used mayonnaise, buttermilk, different things like that. So it's using the Greek yogurt, so you get a little protein in there as well, a little bit healthier with the probiotics. But those are your three pillar ingredients for the dressing. So off of that, as far as substitutions go, the sky's the limit. I mean, you really can just go wild on all kinds of different things that you can add to those three basic ingredients to make a dressing. As far as fresh herbs go, you could do like an Italian one with some fresh basil, some marjoram, some garlic. Go really heavy on the garlic. You could add a little bit of Parmesan cheese to it, just to kind of change it up so that, and you can make these, store them in a container, put them in your refrigerator, and they'll last for quite a while in your refrigerator as long as you keep it nice and cool. With it being something that's homemade that's not got preservatives in it, I wouldn't store it in the door, just because the door of the refrigerator is usually the warmest place in the refrigerator. I try to make sure that we keep it really nice and cool in the back, and that will just help it last a lot longer. But it's something that you can make up 3 or 4 different types of dressings that you enjoy out of one large container of Greek yogurt. Store them in the back of your refrigerator, and whenever you feel like changing up your dressings every now and then, you have the available options. And like she was saying, making these type of things from scratch on your own, you get so much more control over what's put in your food, right? And the more control that you take on of what is going in your foods, just gives you that much more control over your health and well-being going forward. Because we know that there's a lot of things that go into our food today that's not the best things. There's better ways of doing it. So, and if you were wanting to do this type of thing as more of a dip, you would just increase that Greek yogurt by a little bit, or decrease the vinegar. You could also use the unfiltered apple cider vinegar. That would be also another good one to add to this.
And if if you wanted to save time, if you don't have a lot of spices and seasonings at home yet in your spice rack, they do actually sell packets of the spice seasoning mix, ranch seasoning mix for making Greek yogurt dressing. And the spice aisle, they have one that's lower sodium as well. I will say it's a little bit strong. I made it one time just as the directions outlined, and it was really strong for my taste. So I recommend if you do use it, maybe go a little bit light, taste it, add more, because I found it pretty potent.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you guys think? Kind of tangy?
It's been a while since I had it.
Do what?
It's been a while since I had a Greek yogurt.
Oh, yeah.
I mix some
Yeah. Yeah. Just so it doesn't have quite as much of that bite to it. Yeah. Good. Any other questions? Comments, concerns? Yes.
The dressing is fine. What is the green in the salad that has that, I think they call it an earthy taste? It's kind of musty or...
Oh, in that spring mix, more than likely that's dandelion greens. Yeah. It's one of the greens that you either like or you don't.
Or it might be the arugula. Sometimes that arugula is real strong.
I'm trying to see what that one is.
I think that's the one I got a hold of. I got a hold of it in other salads, and no one,
Yeah.
but this one, I think is the one I got a hold of. And it had kind of a musty, earthy flavor.
Yeah. It's definitely not the dandelion.
No.
And I don't think it's the arugula, maybe a baby spinach.
I know that arugula
Looks like a
can be
baby
pretty
spinach.
strong. I'm not used to that. It has a very
Yeah.
peppery taste.
And sometimes the baby spinach can be a little bit more earthy than some of them, so. Any other questions?
Okay, so rolling on to the next one, just our third recipe, which is creamy barley with tomatoes and spinach. So Jared pulled a fast one on me today, and they were out of, well, I guess Woods.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, someone must have came and bought out all the barley at Woods. So must have been making some barley soup or something, because they were out. So we had to use farro instead, which is very similar as far as the texture and the taste. But I am going to talk a little bit about barley. It's kind of what I prepped for, thinking we would have barley here. So barley and also farro, so our whole grains, are a good source of those prebiotics, those good fiber. Barley in particular has a type of prebiotic called beta-glucan, which we also find in oats. And that helps to, again, feed that good bacteria in our gut. Barley has been a grain that we've been eating for thousands and thousands of years, one of the first earliest cultivated grains, and it's one of the most popular grains worldwide. I think it oftentimes gets overlooked as far as its versatility. You know, we can put it in soups and stews, you can make cold salads with it, you can make casseroles. It's just really a versatile grain. It's kind of chewy and nutty, I think, in flavor. And this recipe calls for quick cooking barley, which if anyone has ever cooked any grain, typically they do take a little bit of time, you know, up to 45 minutes if you're going to use the regular pearled or whole barley. If you use the quick cooking, it's a lot faster. It's about 10 minutes usually to cook. What they've done basically is they've just steamed it, so it's easier and faster to cook at home. The nutritional benefits are about the same. They're nearly identical, so there's really no loss in fiber benefit or nutrient benefit by doing that. So I think, was this the one that has the farro in it? Okay, I was thinking of what else. Was there another substitute in this one that we did?
No, it was in the next one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say that the white wine or dry vermouth. Did you guys use that?
We use the white wine.
The white wine,
Yeah.
okay. So if you didn't want to use white wine, maybe you don't like purchasing alcohol or having alcohol in your home, you could use chicken broth instead. Would work just fine.
Yeah. It is going to change the flavor. There's a certain flavor profile whenever you mix tomato and white wine together that the smell, for most people, the smell is just really, really intoxicating. It's a great, no pun intended. It has this scent to it that just makes you want to eat a big bowl of soup, right? And so in this case, we did use the white wine, but again, it's set on the stove from about 11 o'clock this afternoon until just before I came down here at 4:45. So there is absolutely zero alcohol in this whatsoever. So when talking about the recipe, anytime that you can buy, anytime you have a recipe that calls for canned anything, always look for the no added salt recipes, because anytime you can get a little bit less sodium out of your foods, and that's a lot of the reasons for these classes, just trying to make those simple steps that we can make to make our meals a little bit healthier and a little bit more rewarding down the road. So anytime that we can do that, we want to make sure that we do those things, because sometimes we don't have the option to use whole tomatoes and stew them, to have the diced cooked tomatoes, or the barley, or the farro, having it pre-cooked and things like that. Sometimes we got to grab and go and get it in a pot, or get it in a crock pot to cook all day. So we just want to try to make those steps a little bit easier if we can. So, but whenever we're cutting vegetables for cooking, especially in stews and soups and things like that, we have to make sure that we're staying consistent, just like we were talking about earlier with the coleslaw, with our cuts. You're not going to be able to be perfect every single time, I can guarantee you that. But what I will say is, it's so much easier if you take your time. Cutting the onion, I prefer to cut the ends off. Some people like to cut those off after they half it. But it sets so much easier if you half it once the ends are off. So discard of the, if you can grab it and it peel back like this, I don't know if you guys see that. If it can peel back like that without breaking, pitch it. Usually that's something that's a little bit tougher. I know it's fibrous. Tougher isn't really the right word. It's so much more fibrous. So it's scrap. Throw it in your compost. Utilize it that way. Yeah, there you go. We had an entire cooking class on using scraps, right? It's a great class. Doesn't matter the size that you go with. If you want to do a 1/4 inch, if you want to do an 1/8 of an inch, or if you want to do a 1/2 inch, that makes no difference as long as you stay consistent, right? So slice the onion, turn it sideways. Again, knife stays on the cutting board at all times. All right? And as that breaks up, you'll see that it is nice and consistent on its size.
So just like garlic, onion is another great source of that inulin, or that prebiotics. So this dish is super high in fiber. If you look at the serving, it's a 1.5 cups, and that packs in 10 grams of fiber, which is almost half of our daily, what we're recommended to get, which is 25 grams. So really loaded with that. If you're not used to eating a lot of fiber, I do recommend to start slowly. Something like this could really cause you some tummy troubles, maybe more bloating and indigestion if you're not used to a lot of fiber. So if you're adding it into your diet, something like this might be kind of a big load of fiber at one time. You might have to do a little bit smaller portions, or maybe work up to something like this. This is also a really hearty dish. If you notice, it's got close to 500 calories, so it's kind of a meal. I mean, it's pretty hearty. It's going to have a lot of, that fiber is going to help you feel full and satisfied. It's a little bit higher carb, but that fiber in there helps to slow down that digestion of that carbohydrate. So don't let that scare you. And when we see high carb, but we see that high fiber too, that tells us that carbohydrate is going to get digested a little bit more slowly and released into our bloodstream a little bit more slowly. So our body prefers that and likes that.
Yes?
If you were gonna use dry onion,
Are you she asked if you were going to use dry onion, how much would you use? Are you meaning like dehydrated onions? Let's see. This is calling for 1 large onion for this recipe. You could probably utilize probably 2 to 3 ounces. So 1/4 of a cup or 1/3 of a cup. If it's the dry, dehydrated onion that's still pieces. If you were using onion powder, I would say probably a tablespoon or 2. But it's going to be difficult to get the same flavor profile out of those type of things rather than using the whole onion, you know. But you can still make it work. You just have to be careful because if you add too much of the onion powder, it'll really make it bitter. So I would say for this recipe, we said maybe a teaspoon of dry.
Other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, did you drain the diced tomatoes, or did you use fresh ones?
We used the cans.
Yeah, did you drain them, or it doesn't say whether you drain them?
I did not drain them. I utilized the juices from that in it, and that just kind of helps even more with adding that flavor. And as it cooks, you're going to probably, because I feel like this is something I would want to use. I know it says in here to use the pre-cooked barley or the quick-cooked barley and things like that. I really like using things like this, letting it simmer for quite a while. Using the full barley or the farro, which we use the full farro, and this we didn't use a quick cook or anything like that. And just let it sit on there and slowly cook down. You're going to lose a lot of fluid by doing that, but you can just slowly add in a little bit. I just used water and some low sodium chicken base, right? Added that in there just to kind of add a little bit more liquid to it. If you just add water to a soup or something like this, you're really going to dilute the flavor. So you want to try to add some type of broth anytime that you're adding more liquid to it. If you've cooked it for a while and it's kind of depleted and it's a little thicker than you want it, always try to add a little bit of broth to it instead of just water.
I got a question. I'm a diabetic and it's got too many carbs for me. What if I used 1 cup of the barley? Would that still be okay?
Yep.
Would the starch off of that wouldn't thin it down too much?
It would thin down some. I would just cut back a little bit on the water that you would utilize.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was asking about the carbohydrates in it being high for her meal plan with her to control her blood sugar. And another thing is you could just cut down with serving, or you could cut down the amount of barley that you're using in the recipe, so there's not as much barley in the serving.
How about that wine? Doesn't wine have carbs too? So if you take out the wine and put just the chicken stock?
That's a good thought. She's saying that the wine probably has some carbohydrate in it, so by using just chicken stock instead, you might even cut down the carbs a little bit more.
I like the recipes, but I gotta figure out how to cut the carbs. Yeah,
that's something that you might play around with a little bit, maybe cutting down, instead of using 2 cups, using 1 cup, and then maybe upping the protein in it, the chicken or the spinach, or maybe add more vegetables to it, or even just doing a little bit less serving size, more like just a cup instead of 1.5 cup might help too. Good. So, all right, we'll roll right on to the next one, which is greens with cannellini beans. So, kind of a hard one to say, and pancetta. So cannellini beans are essentially just white kidney beans. I think it even says that on the can there. If you couldn't find the cannellini beans, you could use Great Northern beans instead. But beans are an excellent source of those prebiotics. They're high in the beta-glucans. They're high in that good soluble fiber that helps to lower our cholesterol. They're also a natural, plant-based source of protein. So if you're trying to up that plant protein in your diet, and it's a really cheap, affordable protein compared to meats prices these days. So This recipe uses pancetta, which Jared is going to show us how to cook. And the main difference, if I'm understanding correctly, between pancetta and bacon, because you can use either one in this recipe, they're both cured and they're both pork belly, right? But the bacon has been smoked after it's been cured. Is that correct? It's the main difference, I think, between the two.
Yeah, usually if it's smoked.
Yeah, so usually that bacon's just going to have a little bit more of that smoky flavor. So you could really use either one. But this recipe is using just a little bit of that. So you'll see that the sodium total is still pretty low for this recipe. At 2/3 cup, it's only 204 milligrams, which is pretty low sodium. And so it's going to add a lot of flavor. We're just using a little bit that increases that flavor. And so if you have a family member at home that is not a big fan of greens, anyone not a big fan of like kale or spinach, and I've had some family members or even patients struggle with liking their greens. This is one way to kind of maybe get them to lean into liking greens, because we're adding something that a lot of people do like, which is bacon or cured meat, right? It has a lot of flavor, so using that can really help maybe increase the acceptance of the greens. And also it's going to help us to absorb the vitamins and minerals in the greens by having that little bit of fat in there. This recipe also is using beet greens, but unfortunately we didn't have beet greens available. So you could substitute, I think they substituted spinach.
Yes.
Yep, so you could substitute spinach, chard. Yep, it's another great one. So you can kind of substitute out greens that you have on hand or greens that you prefer. Beet greens, though, I would want to mention that they are very, very high in vitamin A and vitamin C, which helps to boost our immune system. And the greens themselves are actually more nutrient dense than the actual root, the actual beet. They have a higher nutrient profile in the greens. So if you have those green tops, try them out. Has anyone ever tried them, saving them and cooking them up? A lot of people just pitch them. But they're full of nutrients, so this is a creative way to use them up.
How do you pick them when they're small? Is that when you pick the tops off of the beets when they're small? Or can you use them even after they get larger?
Yeah, when they're larger or smaller, either way. Yep. Sometimes if you're buying them in the store, sometimes they sell them in a big bundle and they have the big green tops. You want to wash them really well. I find that it can be pretty gritty or dirty. Yeah, pretty dirty. So you want to give them a really good wash. But yeah, just a serving, which is half a cup cooked or 1 cup raw, has over 120% of your daily value for vitamin A and 50% of your daily value for vitamin C. So it's a great immune boosting food.
When talking about the cannellini beans, you can substitute the Great Northern Briar. The one thing that I will say is that these beans are a lot tougher, all right? They're a lot more sturdy than the northern beans. The northern beans are pretty weak. They fall apart very easily. They get mushed up. They get beat up fast. Where these white kidneys just stay together so much better. They're a lot easier to put into a pot with something like this, that you're going to be stirring them in once you get those greens in, to get it to mix up well and everything to disperse well. They're just a lot more sturdy. So you're going to get a lot more whole beans out of using these than you would with the northern briar beans. So the pancetta is an Italian style bacon, so to speak. Like you said, it's the curing process. They don't do the smoking process with it. And most of the time, they utilize it as a cold cut, and they eat it raw. So I know that's a little odd for us to think eating bacon raw, but they shave it really, really thin and eat it raw. So you can basically do this one of two ways, because you're cooking it and then adding it in. So what I would recommend doing is to lay it out on a sheet pan, right? It's been sprayed well. Pop it in your oven, bake it off. I know it's basically pork fat, so why would you spray the pan, right? But what happens more often than not, and I'll show you in the pan here, I purposely didn't bring any oil down to cook this in. Because if you try to cook this, because it's sliced so thin, it's not going to render a lot of that fat out before it starts sticking to the pan. So you'll always want to, I know the recipe doesn't say to add anything to the pan, but you'll definitely want to do that, because if you try to add it in there and just cook it, you're going to pulverize it trying to keep it from sticking. Okay, and that really is just because it's so thin, and it just sticks right to it. Doesn't even have time to kind of release its own fats to lubricate the pan to keep it from sticking. So you can do it whole in the oven. That's probably going to be the easiest process, to be honest with you. Sheet pan it, spray it, pop it in the oven, bake it till it's crispy, pull it out, chop it up, be ready to add it into the beans. Okay? But again, just the thought of eating this raw, I don't know if I can do that. So,
That's surprising because you love bacon.
Who say bacon is raw, who is they?
I do love bacon.
What's the difference between prosciutto and
The seasoning process for sure. Yeah.
the other one seems to be raw?
Yeah, prosciutto has a lot of your dessert type seasonings on it, allspice, cinnamon, nutmeg, different things like that. It's seasoned and cured with, and that's what kind of gives it that aroma that you
Because I
find.
subbed it in a broccoli salad this week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the pancetta, prosciutto, or bacon can be kind of used interchangeably in
Yes.
a lot of recipes.
I would be careful adding prosciutto to a dish that calls for bacon. I would definitely be careful doing that, because you can really alter the flavor using prosciutto over bacon. Again, it's a lot of the same things, but the process that they use in curing it, they use a lot of different spices in that. So you'll just want to be really, really careful. But as you can see in the pan here, without adding a lot of oil or any type of oil to the pan, we've started to stick pretty bad to the bottom. We were able to kind of break it off of there. But because it's so thin, in that process, it's kind of broken it up quite a bit. So just something to think about whenever you're using something like this. You may want to change the way that you cook it just a little bit if you want it to have some nice consistency to it once you get it into the beans and everything else. So we actually use the pancetta and also a little bit of bacon. So.
And one thing about the cured meats that you want to watch out for is the nitrates and nitrites in those can be carcinogenic. It can promote, the development of things like colon cancer. So we want to watch how often we have cured meats that have those in them, or if we can, look for products that are nitrate or nitrite free to help, offset that. And again, it goes to, everything in moderation. It's how often are you doing it. So the frequency is a big deal. So if it's just once in a while, not a big deal. But if you do eat bacon or incorporate cured meats into your diet frequently, we probably want to look out for that. And maybe spend just a little bit extra. I know it can be a little bit more expensive for those options, but it does make a big difference in decreasing our risk for cancers.
When adding the greens into a dish like this, what I would recommend doing, because what will happen is you'll take all those greens, you'll chop them up, and you'll throw them in the pot and start stirring them in, and you'll end up with a lot of clumps of those greens all together. So if you'll add it in maybe fourths, add a fourth of the greens in, stir it in, add the next fourth in, stir it in. That'll help keep it from everything kind of clumping up all together, because then you'll really fight it to get them broken apart. They love kind of sticking together, staying close to one another once they get in the pot and the beans. So add them little by little, and that'll kind of keep it from bundling up too much on you. Okay?
What do you guys think of this recipe? Very good. Do you think you might be able to convert some some greens haters into lovers, maybe?